One of the ideas that I've consistently pushed on this channel ever since I started it was the concept that everybody should go out and find all of the facts surrounding a story and draw their own conclusions. I definitely don't want anybody to look at my reporting or the reporting from CNN, NBC, MSNBC, or Fox or anywhere else and just take that as the final word. It's very important that we do this every time we analyze the news because so many of the narratives out there have been spun in a certain way to get a certain response. Now, last night when I was writing this video, I found myself trying to find all of the facts because I looked at the narrative and what was presented to me initially, and it didn't line up with what had actually happened. And in the process, I rewrote an entire video from scratch, and this is a video that I have been working the concept out for almost a week at this point. The whole concept started when I read a retweet from Jen the Libertarian, who's been on my podcast before. The tweet read like this: From SCOTUS blog, hashtag SCOTUS holds in Nieves versus Bartlett that plaintiff pursuing First Amendment claim arising from allegedly retaliatory arrest must show that officer lacked probable cause to arrest him on any charge. Just to look at the way that this tweet was worded, it's no surprise that people wanted to come out swinging as soon as they saw it. I will be the first to admit I fell into the hysteria and I went into this video looking for a fight. I am not ready to let the government take the mile of presumed guilt because that can so easily be turned against so many of us in the country, so many of us who don't believe that the government has any places in our lives. But once I started reading the case, which I will link below, I realized the fact that this is not what happened at all. In fact, once you actually read down into the text and the decision from the Supreme Court, the exact opposite is actually what's happening when we look into this case. According to the Supreme Court decision, back in 2014 during a music festival in Alaska, Russell Bartlett was walking around presumed intoxicated and telling people not to talk to the police officers that were walking around and trying to make sure that the peace was kept. The two officers in question were Luis Nieves and Bryce Waite. After Bartlett had become aggressive with the officers while they were questioning some minors for the theft of beer from another trailer, the two troopers decided that it was time to arrest Bartlett for disorderly conduct. Now initially they tried to question him and he refused to make a statement to the police officers, and a part of the complaint and a part of the reason that this suit went to the Supreme Court was that while arresting, Officer Nieves allegedly told Bartlett that he sure wishes that he would have talked to the officers at the time. In a setting like this, alcohol was flowing, emotions were running high, and so many of the officers were stretched so thin in the area. So there was a lot of reasonable doubt behind this, and Bartlett decided to take this to trial. His charges were ultimately dismissed because of reasonable doubt, but then Bartlett turned around and decided that he was going to sue the arresting officers for wrongful arrest, based on the fact that they were retaliating against him for exercising his First Amendment. This went to the Alaska Supreme Court, this went to the Ninth Circuit, and this went over to the Supreme Court. Now, in the moment that Bartlett decided to sue the arresting officers, he stopped being the defendant and he became the plaintiff. When this happened, the officers became the defendants, and in doing so, the officers were allotted the same rights as Bartlett had been allotted while he was going through trial. The officers were presumed innocent, barring some major evidence that they had done something wrong. While it is not expressly written in the decision, it appears that every time this case went to a higher court, it got dismissed once again on reasonable doubt. Now, there could have been some body cam footage out there. There could have been more witness testimonies, and the fact that it was 5 years ago meant that all of the evidence surrounding this was sketchy at best. So, once you start looking at this, once you start reading into this, and once you start understanding what went wrong, it's easy to see that the Supreme Court and every court going up to the Supreme Court did make the right decision on this, but First off, I need to understand how this got to the Supreme Court. And the next thing that I need to understand is how 4 justices voted to hear this case in the first place. Interestingly enough, this actually ties in a little bit to things that are happening in major political news. I promised on Friday that I would talk about the infamous line from the Mueller speech, and if you don't remember which line I was talking about, it was this line.
And as set forth in the report after that investigation, if we had had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so.
Given the fact that the special counsel that investigated the president for 3 years was able to say this to the American people with a straight face, we should really be worried, especially now that we also have a Supreme Court that is handing down decisions that can be interpreted in just that right way that now the general citizens of the country might have to prove a negative. Presumed innocence is a cornerstone of our freedom. In fact, it may be one of the most important things that came out of the Constitution, the government that our founding fathers laid before us, because we can debate and get back many of the other rights if they do wind up being taken away from us. That's not going to be hard. As long as we are free people, we are able to go out into the town square and make the case for all of our other rights. But if we start to take away our presumed innocence and the government can start imprisoning people just for having political differences, then we can't defend our other rights anymore, because anybody who would step up to defend any of these other rights would suddenly find themselves deep into the bowels of a political prison. Once you eliminate those who would desire freedom, there is nothing that would stand in the way of the state making the rest of its populace into a series of slaves. There are so many different ways that our basic freedoms are under attack, especially our freedom and our presumed innocence right now, because so many people don't get a regular criminal trial anymore. The governing bodies will find a way to try a person without going through the regular legal channels of going through a court and putting the person before a jury of his peers. One of the things that we have seen so often in these last couple years is the court of social media arising, in which as soon as an accusation is laid against a person, those on Twitter decide the fate of the person before the person can even be questioned by the police. Often the accused is tried and found guilty in the court of Twitter before he ever has a chance to sit down with a detective or a police officer and make his case. Most of the time, it's before the person ever has a chance to contact his lawyer, and by the time that he is tried by the court of Twitter, he is deemed unwelcome in common society because he has committed such a grievous offense against the common society. The idea that Robert Mueller put forward takes us even a step further because it puts that power into the state, should it ever be accepted by the state as a common idea. The idea that they couldn't find anything that proved the president innocent meant that the president wasn't innocent means that it's now okay to criminalize political differences, differing opinions, or anything else that the people decide should shun a person from society. And that's just not a country that we need to live in. As far as Nieves and Bartlett go, this is a case that should have never seen the Supreme Court. But given the fact that it did, we need to deal with it. The officers were the defendants in this case because Mr. Bartlett turned around and filed a lawsuit against them. Therefore, they had the protection of presumption of innocence going into this. And if that changes for them, that changes for the rest of us as well. However, now that this decision is made, the right district attorney can turn around and twist this idea into any sort of general citizen now having to prove a negative, to prove his innocence, and to prove the fact that the officers had no business arresting him. And that is a really, really dangerous idea for this idea of presumed innocence that we have. In all honesty, I want to note where Mr. Bartlett's friends were and what his lawyer was actually thinking at the point that they decided to push this suit. Now, before this ever went to trial, I would have told Mr. Bartlett just to pay his ticket and let it go. Disorderly conduct is not the end of the world, but the fact that he took it to trial and got out of the charges If I was his friends, and hell, if I was his lawyer, I would have told him just the same thing. Just let it go. It's not worth it at this point. Unless there's absolute undeniable evidence that your rights are being trampled by an arresting officer, once those charges are dismissed, just let them go. What do you think about the decision of Nieves versus Bartlett, and what do you think about the idea that Mueller put forward about presumption of innocence and the fact that he no longer believes in it? I always welcome a thoughtful and positive discussion in the comment section below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at EdsBlog Twitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks as always for listening to this show and supporting this channel, and remember, especially now, never take the words of vloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions. Take care.
You're always there for me in my best